Take a breath. Find a comfortable position. Let your body settle into wherever you are right now. There is nothing you need to do, nothing you need to remember, nothing that needs your attention tonight. For the next little while, we're simply going to spend some quiet time with the presidents of the United States. 46 of them, in order. Curious men, complicated men, men who liked dogs and cheese and long walks, men who couldn't sleep, some of them, for reasons not so different from yours. Let the words just wash over you. You don't need to retain any of this. You don't need to remember a single thing. Just let the stories carry you somewhere quiet. We'll begin at the beginning. George Washington, first president, 1789 to 1797. George Washington was a very tall man for his era. He stood 6 feet 2 inches, and in the late 18th century, that was remarkable. People noticed when he entered a room. He didn't need to say anything. He just had to stand there. He had large hands. Several people who met him remarked on this. Large, strong hands. Washington loved dogs more than almost anything else in his life. He kept dozens of them at his estate at Mount Vernon. He gave them names like Drunkard, Taster, Tippler, and Tipsy. He also had hounds named Sweetlips and Madam Moose. He thought carefully about these names. He recorded them all in his diary. He had a passion for farming. He rose before sunrise every morning, even as president, even in winter. He liked to ride the grounds of Mount Vernon on horseback in the early morning quiet, before anyone else was awake. He found it centering. He found it necessary. Washington suffered from several serious illnesses during his lifetime. He contracted smallpox as a young man, which left faint scars on his face. He lost nearly all of his teeth. His famous portraits show a face slightly altered by the ill-fitting dentures he wore, made from ivory and the teeth of other people. This was common at the time. It was still uncomfortable. At the end of his life, Washington asked not to be buried until 3 days had passed since his death. He had a fear, not uncommon in that era, of being buried alive. He wanted to be certain. He died in December of 1799. It was cold. He had ridden in wet weather and gone to bed without changing his clothes, and by the next morning he could not speak. He died that night, calmly, telling the people around him to let him go without trouble. His last recorded words were something close to, "'Tis well." John Adams, second president, 1797 to 1801. John Adams was a short, stout man who knew he was short and stout and was occasionally sensitive about it. He had a sharp mind and a sharper tongue, and he spent much of his life feeling underappreciated. He may not have been wrong about that. He and his wife Abigail wrote letters to each other for decades, thousands of them. Some of the most beautiful letters in American history. When they were apart, which was often because public life took him away, they wrote constantly. He called her his best friend. He meant it. Adams was the first president to live in the White House, though it wasn't quite finished when he moved in. It was damp and cold and drafty. The plaster was still wet in some of the rooms. Abigail used the East Room to hang laundry. He loved books. He accumulated thousands of them over his lifetime, and when he was old and nearly blind, he had them read aloud to him. He said that a room without books felt like a body without a soul. He thought about things like that. Adams and Thomas Jefferson had a complicated friendship, rivals, allies, enemies, and friends again over the course of their long lives. By a coincidence so extraordinary, it has never quite been explained. Both men died on July 4th, 1826. The 50th anniversary of American independence. John Adams's last words, it is said, were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He didn't know that Jefferson had died just hours before. He was 90 years old, the oldest a former president had ever lived at that time. Thomas Jefferson, third president, 1801 to 1809. Thomas Jefferson woke up every morning and put his feet in a bucket of cold water. He had done this for decades. He believed it prevented colds. He almost never got colds. He attributed this to the cold water. He was intensely curious about almost everything. He collected fossils. He studied architecture. He designed his own home at Monticello obsessively, renovating it again and again over 40 years, never quite satisfied with it. He invented a device for copying letters, a plough of improved design, and a wheel cipher for sending coded messages. He catalogued thousands of plant species. He taught himself Spanish in 19 days on a boat crossing the Atlantic, just to have something to do. He had a particular love of macaroni and cheese, and is sometimes credited with helping to popularize it in America after encountering it in Europe. He brought a pasta machine back across the Atlantic. He served macaroni and cheese at White House dinners. His guests were impressed. Jefferson owned one of the largest private libraries in America. When the Library of Congress was burned by the British in 1814, after Jefferson had left office, he sold his personal collection to the government to help rebuild it. Thousands of books. He needed the money. But he also needed, he said, to have books around him. He immediately began buying more. He died, like Adams, on July 4th, 1826. In his last days, he drifted in and out of consciousness. He asked again and again if it was the fourth yet. When it finally arrived, he let go. James Madison, fourth president, 1809 to 1817. James Madison was the smallest president in American history. He stood around 5 feet 4 inches and weighed, by most accounts, less than 100 pounds. He was quiet and often pale and frequently unwell. People who met him for the first time were sometimes surprised that this was the man who had largely written the Constitution. He had a prodigious memory. He could read a page once and recall it almost perfectly. He used this to devastating effect in debates. He would simply remember what the other person had said, word for word, and quietly dismantle it. Madison loved ice cream. His wife, Dolly, loved it more. She served it at White House dinners, and it became something of a sensation. Dolly Madison was vivacious and warm and socially brilliant, everything her husband was not. People loved her. She helped his presidency enormously. When the British burned Washington in 1814, Dolly famously stayed behind long enough to save a large portrait of George Washington before fleeing. She directed servants to cut it from the frame and carry it to safety. Then she left. The White House burned that night. Madison retired to his Virginia estate, Montpelier, after leaving office. He lived quietly there for nearly 20 years, surrounded by books. He died in 1836, the last surviving member of the Constitutional Convention. He was 85. At the end, a niece asked if anything was wrong. He said simply, "Nothing more than a change of mind, my dear." And then he was gone. James Monroe, 5th President, 1817 to 1825. James Monroe was the last president to have fought in the Revolutionary War. He was a young soldier then. He was wounded at the Battle of Trenton, crossing the ice-cold Delaware River in the dark with George Washington. He carried a musket ball in his shoulder for the rest of his life. His presidency was sometimes called the era of good feelings, a period of relative peace and political calm after years of war and tension. It wasn't without problems, but there was a gentleness to it, a quiet after a long storm. Monroe wore old-fashioned clothes, even by the standards of his own time. He dressed in the knee breeches and buckled shoes of the previous century, long after everyone else had moved on. He liked what he liked. He and his wife Elizabeth were deeply devoted to each other, though Elizabeth's health was poor for much of her life. Monroe managed his public duties and his worry about her simultaneously for decades. He died on July 4th, 1831, the third president to die on that particular date. People noticed. They found it meaningful. Perhaps it was. John Quincy Adams, sixth president, 1825 to 1829. John Quincy Adams woke every morning before dawn and went for a walk. Often a very long walk. Sometimes he walked for hours along the Potomac River before breakfast. He believed strongly in physical activity and practiced it with something approaching devotion. In warm months, he sometimes swam in the Potomac, alone, before sunrise, with no one watching. He swam across it on at least one occasion. He was in his 50s at the time. He kept a diary his entire adult life, thousands of pages. He wrote in it every day without fail, recording not just events, but his feelings about them, his disappointments, his self-criticisms, his dreams. It is one of the most detailed personal records left by any American president. Adams owned a pet alligator, which he kept in a bathtub at the White House. It was a gift from the Marquis de Lafayette. He reportedly enjoyed showing it to visiting guests who weren't expecting it. After his presidency, rather than retiring, he ran for Congress and won. He served in the House of Representatives for 17 years after leaving the White House, the only president to do so. He found the work meaningful. He wasn't ready to stop. He died in the Capitol building in 1848 at the age of 80 after collapsing at his desk during a congressional session. He had been carried to the speaker's room. He regained consciousness briefly, said what may have been, "This is the end of earth. I am content," and then slipped away. Andrew Jackson, seventh president, 1829 to 1837. Andrew Jackson had a bullet lodged near his heart for most of his adult life. He had been shot in a duel, and the bullet could not be safely removed. He lived with it for nearly 40 years. Doctors said it occasionally shifted, and this sometimes made him cough. He had participated in numerous duels over his lifetime, over 100 by some accounts, though this number is debated. He was quick to anger and slow to forgive. He carried grudges with the same tenacity he carried everything else. He loved horse racing. He kept racehorses his entire adult life, including while he was president. He wagered on them. He won sometimes. He lost sometimes. He always bet again. Jackson had a pet parrot named Pole, who was present at his funeral in 1845. The parrot had to be removed from the service because it would not stop swearing. It had learned to swear from Jackson himself, apparently, and chose that particular occasion to demonstrate its full vocabulary. The mourners were at first shocked and then amused. It was, people said later, a very Jackson sort of ending. Martin Van Buren, eighth president, 1837 to 1841. Martin Van Buren was the first president born after American independence. The first, that is, who was not a British subject at birth. He was born in 1782 in a small Dutch-speaking community in New York. He grew up speaking Dutch as his first language. English was, in some sense, his second. He was an extremely skilled politician. People called him the Little Magician, a reference both to his modest height and to his political instincts. He was careful. He was strategic. He made few enemies and kept the ones he made very quiet. His wife Hannah died of tuberculosis in 1819, 18 years before he became president. He never remarried. He never spoke about her publicly. He almost never mentioned her at all. In his autobiography, which runs to hundreds of pages, she is barely mentioned. Historians have found this curious and have never entirely explained it. He raised 2 Van Buren tiger cubs, a gift from the Sultan of Oman, briefly at the White House before Congress made him give them to a zoo. He was reportedly quite fond of them. William Henry Harrison, 9th President, 1841. William Henry Harrison delivered the longest inaugural address in American history. It was a cold, wet day in Washington. He stood outside in the wind and the rain without a hat or a coat and spoke for nearly 2 hours. He died 31 days later. He had developed pneumonia. He was 68 years old. He served the shortest term of any president in American history. He never really had a chance to do very much. The doctors tried many things to help him. Most of them made him worse. He died in the early morning hours of April 4th, 1841, having spent most of those 31 days in bed. His last words were addressed seemingly to someone not in the room. He said, "Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more." No one was quite sure who he was speaking to. John Tyler, 10th President, 1841 to 1845. John Tyler became president because William Henry Harrison died. He was the first vice president to assume the office this way, and not everyone was sure he was really president. Some people called him His Accidency. He did not find this funny. He had 15 children, the most of any American president, 8 with his first wife, Letitia, who died in the White House, 7 with his second wife, Julia, whom he married while in office at the age of 54. Julia was 30 years younger than he was. They were happy together. One of Tyler's grandsons was still alive in 2020. This is remarkable and worth sitting with for a moment. A grandson of the 10th President of the United States, who took office in 1841, was alive in the 21st century. American history is not as far away as it sometimes feels. Tyler was the only president to be officially expelled from his own political party while in office. He made decisions his party didn't like, and they simply removed him from it. He finished his term as something like an independent. He didn't seem particularly bothered by this. James K. Polk, 11th President, 1845 to 1849. James K. Polk worked extremely hard. He took his work seriously to a degree that could fairly be called excessive. He worked long hours every day, including Sundays. He rarely took vacations. He rarely took breaks. He was determined to accomplish specific goals, and he accomplished them. He had made a list of things he wanted to do as president. Acquire California, acquire Oregon, reduce tariffs, create an independent treasury. He did all of them. By the end of his term, the United States was a dramatically larger country than it had been at the beginning. He and his wife Sarah were deeply religious. She disapproved of dancing and card playing and did not allow them in the White House. She disapproved of alcohol as well, though she allowed it at formal state dinners. She was strict but gracious about it. The dinners were dry and people went elsewhere afterward. Polk left office and died just 3 months later, in June of 1849. He was 53 years old. He had worked himself into exhaustion and never recovered. He knew toward the end that he was dying. He had his wife baptized and then was baptized himself for the first time in his life. He wanted to die a Christian. He died quietly, at home, in Nashville. Zachary Taylor, 12th President, 1849 to 1850. Zachary Taylor was a decorated war general who had served in 3 wars and had never voted in a presidential election before running in one. He hadn't been in one place long enough. The army kept moving him. He was plain-spoken and unpretentious. He dressed carelessly. He sat his horse in an awkward sideways slouch. He chewed tobacco. He was not what people expected a president to look like, and he mostly didn't seem to mind. He had a horse named Old Whitey, who had served with him in the Mexican-American War. Old Whitey roamed freely on the White House lawn. Tourists visiting the grounds would pull hairs from his tail as souvenirs. He appears to have tolerated this. Taylor died in office in July of 1850 after becoming suddenly and severely ill following 4th of July celebrations. He had spent the day in the heat, eating cherries and iced milk, and was dead 5 days later. He had served only 16 months. Millard Fillmore, 13th President, 1850 to 1853. Millard Fillmore is often listed among the least distinguished presidents in history. He is aware of this, or would be. He was a careful, moderate man in an era that required something more, and he knew it, and it troubled him. He came from genuine poverty. He was largely self-educated. He taught himself law by reading, alone, and passed the bar. He never forgot where he had come from. He is sometimes credited with installing the first bathtub in the White House, though historians debate whether this is accurate or apocryphal. The story was invented as a newspaper hoax in 1917, and then repeated so many times it became accepted as fact. This is a very human thing to happen to a fact. He established the White House Library. That part is true. He thought the executive residence should have books. He was right about that. Franklin Pierce, 14th President, 1853 to 1857. Franklin Pierce was considered one of the most handsome presidents in American history. He was charming and warm and well-liked in person. None of this helped him very much. He and his wife Jane suffered a devastating loss shortly before his inauguration. Their 11-year-old son, Benny, was killed in a train accident. Pierce and Jane watched it happen. They were on the train. They survived. Benny did not. Jane never really recovered. She dressed in mourning clothes for most of Pierce's presidency. She wrote letters to Benny's grave. Pierce carried his grief quietly, and sometimes less quietly, and the weight of it showed in his work. He is generally considered to have made poor decisions that helped accelerate the divisions leading to the Civil War. History has not been kind to him. He had reasons for being the way he was. That doesn't change the outcome, but it is worth knowing. James Buchanan, 15th President, 1857 to 1861. James Buchanan was the only president who never married. He had been engaged as a young man, but his fiancée died unexpectedly before they could wed, and he never pursued another relationship. He was 65 when he took office. He had a peculiar physical trait. One eye was far-sighted, and one was near-sighted. He compensated by tilting his head at a slight angle when he spoke to people, looking at them with whichever eye was more useful at that distance. People sometimes found this disconcerting. He kept a herd of elephants at the White House. They had been sent as a gift from the King of Siam. Actually, the elephants were sent to the American people by diplomatic letter, but they arrived and someone had to keep them somewhere. His presidency preceded the Civil War, and he is generally blamed, with some justification, for doing too little to prevent it. He handed the crisis to Abraham Lincoln and went home to Pennsylvania. He lived to see the war end, which was something. He died in 1868, having maintained, apparently until the end, that history would eventually vindicate him. This has not occurred. Those are the first 15 men in order, from the beginning, with their dogs and their letters and their particular private ways of moving through the world. Let your breathing slow a little. Your body can settle heavier into wherever you are. There's nothing more you need to hold on to from tonight. The story continues with the 16th, a tall, sleepless man from Illinois who kept cats and told long, wandering stories and changed everything. But that is for another time. For now, just rest. The country kept going. So can you. Good night.